Hello. Today we will speak about one of the most important lie, which is now in the new Cold War, the Western countries against China, and in the last years, the Western countries which are responsible for the war in Afghanistan, war in Libya, war in Syria, war in Iraq, they are also responsible for the discrimination of the Muslim minority in France, in other European countries. When the President George W. Bush said, or Donald Trump, that they said many racist things about Muslim communities. Now the Western countries, they want to be the allies or
Friends
the friends of the Muslim community in the
in China.
in the China, in the eastern province of the Xinjiang. In the same time, when the China wants to build the big road from China to Europe, using this province, Xinjiang. So we will try to speak about this all these lies and deconstruct this.
Yes, so first of all, you are right that the very reason of all this propaganda campaign concerning Uyghurs and Xinjiang is basically linked with the fact that Xinjiang is the point where the Belt and Road initiatives begins toward Eurasia, toward Europe, and toward Western Asia. And this is very important because the strategical reason is the base of all this campaign. We have to remember that earlier the main focus against China was based on Tibet. If you remember, 10 years ago, Westerners were crying about the poor Tibetans oppressed by Chinese communists. Now Tibet is not so important because the strategical location of Tibet is not of first importance comparing to the strategical importance of Xinjiang. And now we have to cry for the poor Uyghurs or the poor Muslims of Uyghur, just as we had to cry for the poor Tibetans. But we forgot in the same moment about Tibet because if you look at newspaper and at media, as Western media, you have nothing about Tibet for the last 2 or 3 years, or almost nothing. And just remember that it was completely different 10 years ago. So this shows that the issue of Xinjiang and of Uyghur is purely opportunistic and has nothing to do with the real situation there. It's linked with the strategical Belt and Road initiatives, with the railways built by China from Xi'an, it means in eastern China, through Xinjiang toward Russia and Western Europe, and toward Asia, toward Pakistan, toward also Iran, and further toward the Mediterranean Sea. And of course, it is also very important to know one fact that nobody's in our media tell about, is the fact that the Belt and Road initiatives is supposed to arrive at the Mediterranean Sea coast in Syria. And by some strange, but not so strange situation, in the north of Syria, on the Turkish Syrian border, you have group of Uyghur terrorists who occupied villages and regions very near the Mediterranean Sea. So we have the Uyghur question in China, but we find Uyghur terrorists that are concentrated on the other side of the Belt and Road Initiative, just on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, where the Belt and Road Initiative is supposed to arrive at the very end of the project. So it is very clear if you look at the map that the Uyghur question is a pretext to fight against China. Of course, you have other pretexts. You have human rights, you have Taiwan, you have Hong Kong, you have Tibet, as I told you. But of course, the main topic is now on Xinjiang for the moment, and that's the basic reason of this of raising this question in the so-called international media, which are basically Western or pro-Western medias, and that's the base of the situation. Now, what is the real situation in Xinjiang? We have also to take into account. We have also to we have to take into account, first of all, that Xinjiang was traditionally a very poor region. Even on former Chinese standards, it means we have to remember that China was up to very recently a very poor country with a lot of poverty, and this has been changed only recently. But even if we know that China was a poor country, Xinjiang and Western China are the poorest region of the formerly poor China. So of course, this explains also situation that you will find, of course, as in every region where you have poor people, you have people which are not satisfied by the situation, and it's quite easy then to find among them people who will accept to cooperate, to collaborate with people bringing them money. And as we know from the colored revolution here and there, foundations, NGOs, and other state-funded or private-funded organization are always paying people who can promote their policies, their interest in different countries. And the situation is, of course, the same in Xinjiang. It was not very difficult to find some poor young Uyghurs, like in China, poor young Chinese, like in Hong Kong, taking money to promote the Western or the American agenda. Of course, it doesn't mean that the situation in Xinjiang is very good for all reasons, but it means that you have some cause of miscontent in this area. But basically, if we look at the situation, the economical and social situation in Xinjiang from the beginning of the Chinese Revolution up to now, we see that the situation in Xinjiang is improving very quickly and to a large extent more quickly than in the average China. The building of enterprises, of railways, of roads, of hospitals, of universities is very important there, and this create, of course, a lot of opportunities, and quite a lot of Uyghur people seems to be at least very happy with what is happening. And we have to remember that Xinjiang is a so-called autonomous region. It means that the local power have more power than a normal, let's say, Chinese province, and that all the leadership of the Uyghur autonomous region is to a large extent reserved for people coming from ethnic minorities, not only Uyghurs, because the Uyghurs are the biggest minority in Xinjiang, but you have other nationalities such as Kazakhs, Tajiks, Mongolians, Hui, and different population, and of course Han Chinese, who are also living there. So Xinjiang is a multinational, multi-ethnic region, but the majority of the Xinjiang population is Uyghur, and that's why the Uyghur language have an official status there, and that in school you learn Chinese, of course, but you learn also Uyghur. And we have also to take into account one thing which is very important, is that the functionaries named, recruited in Xinjiang are partly coming from other region of China, because in other region of China which are more advanced, you have of course more people with education, and that are able to take different functions. But when a non-Uyghur functionary is named, is recruited in Xinjiang, he will have a special bonus when he learns the local language, which means the Uyghur language or the language of other minorities in Xinjiang. So we have to take that into account, because I don't think that American functionaries who are working in the let's say Indian administration of the United States government have bonuses when they learn one of the American Indian language. We have to take that into account. If we compare, let's compare to the very end. And of course, in Western Europe, we have the same situation. A British functionary named in Wales will not have bonus if he learned the Welsh language, and so on and so on and so on. So we have to take that into account, because they will never remind you that the Uyghur languages and other languages of minorities are promoted legally in this autonomous region. It doesn't mean that there are no problems and that there are no differences and that you have no tensions between some of the aspirations of the local population and the manner the central authorities are dealing with them. But of course, they are trying to promote a policy to, let's say, to recruit people with, let's say, a progressive orientation, because that's also another reason, because as we know, China is a country that had revolution, but the revolution was not only against foreign powers, imperialist powers, but also was a revolution against traditionalist and reactionary ideas. You find not only among Han Chinese, but you find among national minorities. It means that the former society was a feudal society, and the ideas that developed in Xinjiang, in Tibet, or in other Chinese region are not all progressive just because they are coming from a national minority. They can be very reactionary. And of course, this is linked with the question of religion to a large extent. This is linked with the question of religion. Because, as you know, and it's not special for China, it's all over the world, religion can very easily, and was very easily, all religions can and are very easily exploited by dominant classes to dominate working classes. And of course, in Xinjiang, Islam was used for centuries as a tool of exploitation. Of course, the question, what is Islam and how it works and how it can be interpreted, is a complicated issue, and You have different schools, different way of looking at Islamic religion, just as you have in Christianity, where you can have the liberation theology of Latin America, for example. In the same time, you have the reactionary priests, which are almost fascist, inside the same, let's say, inside the same Christianity. And in Islam, it's exactly the same. You have the reactionary classes that use Islam as a tool to dominate working classes. And of course, you can have interpretations of Islamic text in a much more progressive way. The problem, of course, of China was that basically, as you can imagine, the revolution was done in mainland China, mostly in Chinese traditional region, and communists were most of the time quite aware how to fight religious reactionary beliefs within the let's say Chinese national tradition. For them, it was much more difficult to understand how functions Islam, because they come from central China, and they didn't really knew Islam, and of course they could consider Islam the same way they considered Chinese traditional religions. And they had, it took us some time for them to understand that, of course, just as you have Buddhist specificity, you have Islamic specificity, Christian specificity, and so on and so on, and that a scientifically promoted progressive policy has to take into account the differences. But if we, and you know, I will not talk about the whole history of the Chinese Revolution, but you know that we had in China different moments, and especially we had the Cultural Revolution, and then the Deng Xiaoping reforms, and so on. And you can imagine that within all that moments of the Chinese Revolution, the attitude of the Chinese state, of Chinese functionaries toward, let's say, Islam in Xinjiang changed quite a lot. What is now the situation of Islam in China, and especially in Xinjiang, because there are other regions of China which are Muslim, but not Xinjiang and not Uyghur. The basic, what is the situation? The situation is quite funny, because there are more mosques in China per let's say per believer than you have in most Muslim countries. The number of mosques there is superior to the number of mosques by inhabitants you find in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, in Iran, and in most of Muslim countries. So this shows one thing, that Islam as such is not fought by the Communist Party. The question, of course, is which Islam, and of course, the Islam the government and the Communist Party is promoting in Xinjiang is, of course, and let's say secular Islam, or secularized Islam, which is contrary to the traditional, let's say, post-feudal or feudal Islam. And of course, you can understand that the social milieus in Xinjiang, which were linked with the former dominant classes, are not happy with that. For example, one of the leaders, let's say, of the Uyghur cause in France especially, which is teaching Uyghur language, and which is at the forefront of Uyghur nationalism and Uyghur, let's say, quote, human rights propaganda, she recognized herself that she is coming from a family that was before the revolution on the side of on an exploiting landlord family. She recognized and she says, "Oh, my family, we were very oppressed after the Chinese Revolution." But she says, due to class reason. She recognized that the basic repression they suffered from are not linked with the fact that she was Uyghur. That is not linked with the fact that she was Muslim, but is linked with the fact that she was coming from an exploiting class in this society. And so she pretend to be repressed as a Uyghur, she pretend to be repressed as a Muslim, but in fact she herself recognized that she belonged to the former dominant classes of the Chinese and Uyghur society, and it's very important, because if we let aside the class situation, we do not understand anything about what's happening in China, and especially, of course, what is happening in Xinjiang. Because, as I told you, religion is exploited by different class interests. On the same time, there is another thing which can be exploited simultaneously. It's because Uyghurs are not only an ethnic group with Muslim roots, it's an ethnic group with Turkish language. And from the beginning of the 20th century, we had in Turkey the development not only of the traditional Islam, but we had also the development of, let's say, modernistic nationalism. And the nationalism that developed in Turkey at the end of the Ottoman Empire and later came to power with Atatürk in Turkey is nationalism based on language and race. What is called the Panturanism. The Panturanism is an ideology which is quite similar to the German nationalist ideology. The German nationalist ideology, as you know, was based on the myth of the Aryan race. And the Turkish nationalism is based on the myth of the Turanian or Turkish races. And supposedly, from Turkey up to Mongolia, including then Xinjiang, you have so-called Turkic races, which are supposed to promote a Turkish unity, a pan-Turkish empire. And the extreme right in Turkey developed that ideology. And of course, they tried, especially after the dismantling of Soviet Union, they tried to promote this policy in former, let's say, Turkish Soviet republics like Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and so on. And later, out of Kazakhstan, they arrived in China, and they tried, to a certain extent, they managed to create the myth that the Uyghurs are compatriots with the Turks from Turkey, and they send money from that. And when Erdogan arrived in power in Turkey, he promoted a new unified vision. Since Atatürk's vision was purely nationalistic or even racist to a certain extent, but secularized. Erdogan managed to realize something like a synthesis of the former pan-Islamic conservative view mixed with the pan-Turkic nationalist and secularized view. And with those two elements, the Turkish extreme right arrived in Xinjiang with the idea that Uyghurs are Turks and Muslims, and because of that, they must join the big Turkish nation. And that's one reason we have to think about because as I told you, in China we have different Muslim. We have Uyghurs. We have different nationalities which are Muslim, but we have also, let's say, pure, of course, quote, pure Chinese Muslims, which are called the Hui. That's people from mostly Chinese origin, partly Arabic and Persian, but mostly Chinese origin, who converted to Islam 1,000 years ago, because Islam has a very old tradition, in China. But and we have to take that into account. I mean, when we have all this propaganda against the fact that the Muslims are repressed in China, they always talk about Uyghurs. They never talk about Hui. Because Hui are pure Chinese, linguistically speaking, and they are, of course, much more integrated with Chinese society for this reason, for linguistic reason, and you cannot use them to promote separatism, as you can try to do in Xinjiang, using on one side religion, but the religion is not enough. You have to use a second tool, and the second tool is ethnical nationalism, Turkish nationalism. And when you mix the Turkish nationalism with Islam, you have much more chance much more possibility to manipulate part of the opinion. For the secularized part of the population, you will promote Turkish nationalism, and for the religious part, you will promote Islamic integrism. And the ideal is to use both tools, as you have in Syria, as I told you, where a group of Uyghur terrorists used by Turkey in northern Syria now are militants who kicked out the local Arab population. We have to take that into account. They expelled Arabs from the village they were living in, and they now live in this region and created Uyghurs, militarized Uyghur communities, which are both extreme Islamist and extreme national Turks.
But wait, Bruno, because I don't understand one thing. It's not logic for me. In the same time, the Western countries, they are against the pan-Turkism in the question of Armenia. They made this official statement that in the Armenia was the genocide, and because of the nationalist question and because of the religious question. So they are against this pan-Turkism in the Armenia, and in the same time they support the
That's it. Imperialists, they are very opportunistic and very cynical. And that's the point. I mean, why they have success. Because everywhere people look at what they are doing in their own environment. But when you look at things on the global way, then you understand that in Caucasus they will use the Armenian nationalism against the Turkish nationalism. But in the same time, they will use Turkish nationalism in Central Asia against Russia or against China. They will use Turkish nationalism against Arabs. But they will support Kurdish nationalism against Turks. It's the divide strategy. And all what we have to do, the progressive revolutionaries, is to show how cynical they are. But they did it all the time. In India, for example, at the colonial times, the British were supported Hindu integrism against Muslims. In the same time, they were pushing Muslims against the Hindus. They created, as we know, the Zionist problem, using Jews against Arabs and later Arabs against Jews. In Africa, they used one tribe against another tribe, and in the neighboring country, exactly the contrary. The tribe they help in one country, they fight against in the other country, and so on and so on. It's terrible because it works as long as people do not understand what is behind. And most of the time, it's very difficult to understand who is behind. So, for example, now Pakistan is one of the country in the world which is one of the best friends of China. As you know, Pakistan is an Islamic republic, so it is officially an Islamic state. But it's of course it's a relatively now progressive Islamic state, since the actual Prime Minister Imran Khan is coming from what I would say the Islamic left. Let's say, and he is anti-imperialist and he is quite pro-socially oriented. But since Pakistan is an Islamic state, the American cannot promote Islam against Islam, so they use nationalism. And for example, there is a cooperation project between China and Pakistan, the so-called Gwadar port, which will be at the very end of the project one of the main port for Chinese importations of goods to China and exportation of Chinese goods in the Indian Ocean. And of course, the Belt and Road initiatives will go from Xinjiang up to the Indian Ocean, and especially to the port of Gwadar. But Gwadar is in one region of the Pakistan, which is called the Baluchistan, where you have a local nationality, Baluchis, who are living in this region. And Baluchistan is one of the provinces of Pakistan. There, you cannot use Islam as a tool to fight Pakistani government or Chinese, because they are cooperating. So you use the Baluchi nationalism. And we know now that the terrorist group, which is called the Jundallah, it means the Army of Allah, which is a separatist group tending to promote an independent Baluchistan and a reunified Baluchistan against Pakistan and against Iran, which is the other enemy of the United States in the region. They use the tool of Baluchi nationalism, forgetting, of course, the fact that if Baluchistan is belonging to Pakistan, it's because at the time of the colony, the British conquered Baluchistan and forced Baluchistan to be with British India and later with Pakistan. So they created the problem in the 19th century, and now they are using this problem against Pakistani authorities. And they use the nationalist card in Baluchistan, and in other regions of the world they use the religious question, as they did in Afghanistan when they were fighting the Soviet. The Americans were using Islam. But when the Soviets left Afghanistan, then the Islam began to be a problem for the Americans, and then they invaded Afghanistan under the pretext of fighting religious extremism and to liberate the so-called Afghan woman. If you remember what was their propaganda at the time the American invaded Afghanistan. So one time they used Islam, the second time they fight against them. So they can fight Islam in Afghanistan and use Islam in Xinjiang. They can promote a secular government in Tunisia with Ben Ali, and in the same time they promote the extremist Islamic government in Saudi Arabia. They have no problem with that, just like you say, as they can use Armenian against Turks here, and in another region they will use Turks against Chinese or Russian or whatever they want. They have no problem with, they have no principle. Their only principle is money. What gives money is good. What doesn't give money is not good. So they can support one nation or one state or one religion when they can use it, and they fight it when it happens to be useless or even contrary to their interests. So don't think that the United States and the imperialists have a global project for the whole world living in peace under capitalism. They have a global project of a worldwide capitalism which cannot develop without wars and without conflicts. And for them, it's not important if the conflicts have appeared to be religious, ethnical, ideological, or whatever you want. The most important is that there would be war, that the arm production will raise, that the benefits from war will raise, and that after the war you will have benefit because you will have to rebuild what you destroyed earlier. And in the case of Xinjiang, it's very clear. You have to destroy Xinjiang because it's the base of the Belt and Road, the Chinese Belt and Road initiatives, to promote the independence, so-called independence of Xinjiang out of China, and to make out of Xinjiang an American colony after that. An imperialist colony under the pretext of Islam, of Turkish nationalism, of whatever you want. The pretext is secondary. The basic issue is to fight against national liberation movement, to fight against independent states and independent economies, and to promote its imperialist interest all over the world under very different pretexts. Because if you concentrate on ideological questions, you cannot understand why United States have good friends in Saudi Arabia, and in the same time they have good friends in, let's say, secular Egypt of Sisi, and nationalistic regime, almost fascistic in Brazil, etc., etc. For them, it's just an appearance. They don't care about the formal ideology a regime had. As soon as the regime is guaranteeing the interest of the big bourgeoisie, of the big capital, of the transnational capital, of money benefits for their enterprises, which can be peaceful enterprises or war enterprises, depending which one are on the forefront in a certain country at a certain moment. So the Xinjiang issues is, of course, a pure pretext. It doesn't mean that there are no problems in Xinjiang. You have problems in Xinjiang, as everywhere in the world. But the difference is that some problems are ignored by the imperialists because they are not useful for them. And in other regions of the world, like Xinjiang, the problem can be exploited by imperialists for their aggression against a country, a state they don't like. And of course, so-called communist China is for them an enemy because it's a powerful country, because it's a developing country, and especially because it's a country promoting self-sufficiency and development, not using capitalist tool, and not giving the American capitals the rights they have in subordinated countries. For them, of course, India is a much better country than China because they can use Indian economy as they want. That's the reason why they support Modi, the Prime Minister of India, which is an extreme anti-Muslim leader. He's almost fascistic. He is fascistic, in fact, because if you look at the ideology of the party he's leading, this party was built in the 30s, officially advocating Hitler's Aryanic thesis, and these theses are still the base of the actual ideology of Modi's India. And you don't hear in the Western media about the oppression of the Kashmiri people under Modi, which they are living there in a permanent martial law. They are arrested massively. They are Muslim, and they are oppressed. But of course, you have no campaign all over the world about the rights of the Indian Muslims, and especially the right of the Kashmir Muslims, because Modi is the ally of the United States under the so-called Quad. The Quad is the southern NATO. It's the military treaty between India, Japan, United States, Australia. It's the NATO of the Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean. And of course, you don't have any media campaign concerning Kashmir because Modi is the friend of the United States. So they prefer us to cry about poor Uyghurs and poor Chinese Muslims. Just that we have to forget about Kashmiri Muslims. And that's the proof. They are very cynical. When Pakistan was on the side of United States and India was a real non-aligned country, the devil was India at that time, not Pakistan. Pakistan was okay, even if it were military governments. Now Pakistan is not okay and India is good. That's the point.
There are two questions from the chat, but I also want to ask you a question. Yeah. Could you? My question is: could you say something about the Aboriginal citizens of the Taiwan island? Because before the Chiang Kai-shek arrived in this island and built their military dictatorship, which was after the puppet of the Western imperialism, there was the big population of the people which are not Chinese. Now I think it is 2 or 3% of this population. If there are any autonomy for these people, if they are the NGOs from the Western countries, they speak something about this Aboriginal from Taiwan, they organize the campaign against the cultural genocide or stuff like this. So it is my question, and I will read the question of Cyril Jakubowski. What extent Uyghurs were involved in the creation of Daesh state and imperialism wars against Syria? And question Femboy ze szkolnej. Can the Uyghurs be rehabilitated, or will it look like filling a leaky bucket with water?
Yeah, I don't really understood.
I also don't understand. I only read.
Okay. So anyway, concerning Taiwan, of course, situation has changed now. Of course, first of all, the Aborigines of Taiwan were in Taiwan. The majority of the population of up to the 17th century. In the 17th century, you had the beginning of Chinese immigration to mainland Chinese immigration to Taiwan, and very quickly the Han Chinese became majority of the population. And in the 18th century, Taiwan was almost Chinese, as you say. At that time, also the Aborigines were about 3-4% of the population. So this situation is not new. What is, of course, traditional, I would say, in Taiwan, under the Chinese government and later the Japanese government and later the Chiang Kai-shek government, is of course that the Aborigines of Taiwan were marginalized as a minority without any rights, and the People's China, the People's Republic of China, after the creation of the People's Republic of China, advocated for, in theory, because of course they don't control Taiwan, they advocated for the Aborigines of Taiwan the same minority rights they have for minorities inside China, so the creation of autonomous region and so on. Of course, the Kuomintang, the Chiang Kai-shek government didn't thought about that, and nobody cared about Aborigines up to recently. Now, yeah, they are 2 or 3%. Taiwan is an economy which is based partly, of course, on tourism, and they began to change the situation of the Aborigines in a, let's say, Indian American way. It means, something like reservation and touristical areas showing, special dances and so on. But it's all about money and economy. You cannot tell that the Aborigines are really master of their destiny. They are just used as touristical tools for Chinese or non-Chinese tourists. And of course, the political issue of the Aborigines were never used by Western powers. It was only mentioned by Chinese communist propaganda, who was telling that if the communists would have controlled Taiwan, the Aborigines would have the autonomy status other minorities have in different regions of China. But of course, that's purely theoretical, since Taiwan, as you know, is not under communist rule. Concerning Uyghur, the problem in Syria, the problem we have, I mean, it's not a big problem, but we know that in Syria, we had a lot of different extremist organizations created under the protection of Turkey, of Saudi Arabia, of Qatar, of United States, of France, and so on. And Daesh or ISIS is only one of them. And it's not very clear if the so-called East Turkestan movement based in the Idlib region of Syria under Turkish protection is rather linked with Daesh or with another faction of protected by Turks Islamist group. I would say it's not important exactly to which group they belong. What is important is that they are linked with all these international of extremist Islamists used by different power, but especially by Turkey, and who behave in a very extremist way, of course, against non-Muslim Syrians, especially against Armenians, who are living in the very near region from the front line on the Turkish border. But they behaved in an extremist way also against Arabs and even Muslim Arabs living in the region. They transform in something like a fortress to train their commandos, now used in Syria, but of course also constituting a base for extremism toward Xinjiang. And that's very important to know that the so-called Human Rights Association of Uyghurs we have in the Western world, in United States, in Germany, in France, and etc., are supposedly, of course, liberal Democrats, and they claim that they are liberal Democrats, but they never take any action either on political ground or media ground, against the extremist Uyghur located in, let's say, Turkish-controlled Syria, northern Syria. And it shows how cynical is the situation, because you have in fact two wings cooperating, as everywhere in the world. I mean, everywhere in the world, imperialists are using religious extremism on one side and liberal democratic ideology on the same time, and both trends are in fact cooperating to destroy more or less progressive or independent states. So the Uyghur question can be used as an extremist tool or as a, let's say, moderate tool, as we saw during the Syrian war. I mean, you had the so-called moderate opposition and the extremist opposition, but if you look in the ground in Syria, you see that the so-called moderate armed group can one day be moderate, and the second day they submit to an extremist leader, and then they change their leaders, and they don't care, in fact, if they are extremist or moderate. But of course, in the media, it looks very fine to make this distinction, which doesn't exist between moderate and extremist, because in fact it doesn't exist everywhere, and of course it doesn't exist in Uyghur case. Or as you have the same thing in Ukraine or in Belarusia. You heard about the Protasevich case now due to this Ryanair plane. He was promoted as a pure Democrat, and now it happens it was a fascist, and it doesn't create problem for so-called liberal Democrats to use a fascist liberal Democrat quote. And you can use also an extremist Democrat Islamist. Why not? If you can have a fascist Democrat, you can have an extremist Democrat. Is in the Islamic world or inside the Turkish world. So that's the basic question. But we have to know that the majority of the Uyghur people looks, if you depend not on Chinese sources, but on sources coming from different people who visited Xinjiang, from very different background. It can be diplomats, it can be journalists, it can be Westerners, it can be Muslims, because Xinjiang is an open region. You can go to Xinjiang. It's not a closed region. So if you want to visit China, you have the right to visit Xinjiang. It's not forbidden, and you can do it. And people who go there, having very different opinions, they go there, they talk with people, you have tons of videos you can have on YouTube about people coming from Xinjiang, and you see that at least quite an important part of the Uyghur population is quite happy now, because as the base of the Belt and Road Initiative, Xinjiang is a very quickly developing region. So you have quite a lot of people which are happy with the development. And some of the extremists that were taken after very, very, very barbarian terroristic attacks in Xinjiang or in other regions of China were re-educated and are working now in a peaceful way. You can say it's a pure propaganda and so on, but anyway, it exists. These people change their minds and change their behavior, and you have to take that into account. I mean, that's right that the extremism developed in Xinjiang on the base of poverty. Now that poverty is less important that it was. Of course, things are changing, and it's a quite normal evolution. So I don't say that Xinjiang is a paradise. For sure, it's not a paradise, but it's a region where you can live quite well, comparing with the condition you had 10 years ago or 30 years ago. So the situation is improving, and quite a lot of Uyghur can have quite a good situation. 10 years ago, I had in Brussels a scientific conference, and I met then permanent employee of the Chinese Central Committee of the Communist Party. And we talk about a lot of things, and I must say he was much less anti-capitalist than I was. He was much less anti-American than I was, even if he was working for the Central Committee. And that's one thing I want to say. It shows that the Communist Party of China is quite pluralistic, because in the same time I met Communist Party members which were much more, let's say, revolutionary than he was. That's one thing. And he told me one thing. At that time there was no campaign concerning Uyghurs, and he was a Han Chinese, and he told me, we Chinese, we don't really understand sometimes the specificity of different regions, and I think that in Uyghur, in Xinjiang, we have a policy concerning religion and concerning Islam, which doesn't take into account the specificity of Islam. I think that we make a lot of error, and that we will have to pay for it earlier or later. But it's not because we don't like Uyghurs, we don't like Muslim, we don't like Islam, we feel chauvinistic about Han Chinese culture. It's just because the local specificity of Uyghur and Xinjiang, we don't really understand it, and we make error, and we have to teach to learn the situation there in another way. He was quite freely. I mean, I was at the conference was in the European Parliament, which is not a revolutionary organization, as you can know. So he was freely telling what he was thinking. I even, as I told you, I was not really having the same opinion of as he had. For me, he was quite naive concerning Western world, concerning United States, concerning capitalism, and so on. But this conversation was very interesting in the fact that he openly recognized that there are problems in China, that China is not the ideal society, that China is progressing and improving things. But Chinese are not genius who understand the whole world, and they don't understand their whole world, and they made error, and they will make error, and they will try to correct them. And his opinion is this one, and other communists have a little bit different opinion on this question and on this question. And you have the impression, I had the impression, and I met a lot of other Chinese, that Chinese people are very open-minded, and that within the one-party system you have quite a pluralistic society where you have debates, very, very important debates we have not in the West. Because if you look at the debates we have in China inside the Communist Party, it's debate about fundamental questions, economical issues, social issues, class issues, cultural issues, and they are very, very, very strong. What characterizes the Communist Party of China is that the debates are very open, and that after, when the decision is taken, it's the democratic centralism, and the majority decide, and then everybody has to promote the policy that has been decided. But as I told I had a conversation recently with an Australian professor who is working at Beijing University. He's Australian, but he's working there, and he's teaching at the university. And he told me one thing that is very important. He told me, Western people don't want to know what's happening in China. They have their ethnocentric point of view, and they don't want to know what's happening in China because they have just to look at the debates in internet between Chinese on national questions, international questions, ethnical question, class question, and so on, and they will see that it is it is a very let's say pluralistic society, a very educated society, and they say, of course, Westerners says that they cannot understand Chinese, so they cannot go to internet and look there. But he says you have now you have the a very good automatic translation. I don't know how you call it in English. Automatic translation. Logiciel in French, I forgot, which is DeepL, and where you can take a Chinese text, put it in Chinese, and translate it in English, French, or Polish, even if you want, or Russian. And he says this DeepL is very good. Of course, not for literature, but for political text, it's very good. So if you want to know what Chinese are really discussing about, there is no problem. You go to the CPC debate website, or to a lot of websites of different Chinese media or scientific media. You take you take the text, you translate it, and you will see how Chinese are discussing, and you will discover that China is a very open society in this sense that they are discussing about things Westerners don't have the courage to discuss about. Because we have no debate in the Western world about except for a tiny minority, but massively we have no huge debate on class question, on social projects. He told, in China you have websites who have about 100 million subscribers. Of course, China is a very big country, but you see that it's a mass discussion. Everybody is discussing in China about central issues. But of course, China is a disciplined society because of the old Confucian tradition, and of course because of the communist tradition. So Chinese discuss, and when the discussion is finished, they vote inside the Communist Party or on local grounds. And when the vote is finished, the decision is taken by all. And that's very difficult for us Westerners to understand that. You can have very free discussion and one decision after. And of course, it's communists understand that because they know what is democratic centralism, or at least what should be democratic centralism. But non-communists don't understand that, and they think that if there is one party, it means that there is no democracy. But in fact, there is more democracy in China than in the Western world, because the debate inside the party are much more open than the debates you have in the United States between the so-called Democrats and the so-called Republicans, or in France between the so-called Macron and the so-called Le Pen, or in Poland between so-called Kaczynski and so-called Tusk. There are no debates. They are just fighting each other for individual promotion, but there are no society debate. You have that in China. And of course, the Uyghur question is one of the question, as the religious question is debated, as the Tibetan question is debated. And if you look at Tibetan websites in China, you will see that you have very, very, very strong debate between the ones who are telling that the Tibetan culture is very good and the ones who are saying that the Tibetan culture was so ruined by feudals that we have to create a new feudal culture under the communism of the Communist Party of China. And all that, we don't know about it in the West. We just don't want to know about that because it would ruin our impression that, Western world is free and China is a dictatorship. Basically, I would say that I don't say that China is pure freedom, but the freedom of discussion in China is, as it seems to me, much more developed than in the West, not due to the fact that the leader of China is a good man, but due to the fact that the Chinese society is much more politically educated and capable to think politically than the Western society, where we are all brought up in a mixture of so-called democracy, which is nothing. I ask people on the street what is democracy. They will tell you, oh, it's to vote every 4 years. But what kind of democracy it is when you have 5 minutes in 4 years to decide eventually something, and all other minutes you have to listen to what the government is telling. In socialist country, especially in China, you have all the time reunions, political reunion, where you discuss in your factory, in your street about everyday lives, everyday questions. You have reunion in China, in Cuba, in Vietnam. You all the time discuss about how the country is governed and how it has to be going and how it has to be changed and so on. So where is the freedom then? In the country where you have reunion all the time talking about politics, or in country where you have no political reunion and you have 5 minutes every 4 years to decide which autocrat you will vote for, because at the very end it's that. I mean, Biden or Trump, Kaczynski or Tusk, they as soon as they're elected, they do what they want, or rather, they do what the big bourgeoisie tells them to do, because they are just puppet actually from the bourgeoisie leadership. So I don't idealize Chinese model, but at least they discuss there. And they criticize, and they have some form of discussion we cannot imagine here, because we have no tool for that, because 90% of the society in Western world are not politically educated. They don't know basic economical, basic political things, not to talk about philosophical things. And if you don't know politics, you don't know economy, you don't know philosophy, they can give you freedom, but it's a pure theoretical freedom, because the real freedom you have only when you have something in your head. If you haven't, you cannot be free. Because you have just to look, what is the color of the shirt of the candidate A, and the color of the shirt of the candidate B, and then you vote for the candidate B because you prefer pink color than black color. That's not democracy.
Okay, I will add to this question that in the time when we have a campaign electoral, that normally we have one or two party which all the time there are in media, and most of the time it's for them.
Yeah,
And when they organize one debate for all the candidates, it is that there are 10 person or more, and everybody can speak 3 times 1 minute, for example.
yeah,
And this all the campaign. And
that's it.
in the United States, the candidates which are not the member of the Republican Party or Democratic Party, they are don't they are never invited to the media to
Yeah, and most Americans don't even know their names because they have no occasion to know their names. They have no time to know their names because they have a 8 hours job. Then they have 1 or 2 hours to go back to home because they live at the other end of the city. They come home back, they eat, they look at TV where you have Democrat and Republican, and then decide to which one of them they will vote. And that's why half of the people don't vote anymore because they know that it has no sense. And they call that democracy. In China, you have all the time the reunion where you talk about democracy, where you talk. You can don't agree with what the first secretary of your local party organization is telling you, but still, at least you can tell him. You can have discussion, debate, and so on. I will maybe finish with that anecdote I had in Poland after the change of regime. It was in the 90s, and in my compartment in the train, there was an officer of the army. And he was, and in Poland we discuss in the compartment how are things going and so on. So I asked, or somebody in the compartment asked him, I don't remember. No, how is the situation looking like in the army now? Since there are all being all these changes, the army was the army of a socialist country. Now you are the army of the so-called democratic country. And what concretely changed in your life? And he told, the situation is much less democratic than it was earlier, because at the time of socialism, in the army we had the party organization. And in the party organization, you had members which were officers and members which were pure soldiers. And they were all in the same party organization. And you could have a situation when the soldier was the first secretary of the party organization, and the officer was just, was not having any function in the party. So the situation could be completely reversed than the normal hierarchy inside the army. And because of that, high officer were informed of problems coming from the ground. Because at the party organization, they were all supposed to be comrades, and they were discussing, and the soldier had equal voice than the officers. But as soon as we liquidated the party organization in the army, the officer is on one side, the soldiers are on one side, and the officer don't know what are the problem of the soldiers, and the soldier have no possibility to inform officer. And he finished telling, there is something which is quite good now. It's because in the army we have priests. Of course, it's much worse than the party organization, but at least when one soldiers go to the priest can tell that to the officers. And some of problems can be solved by the priest, but it was much better when you had the party organization. It was a non-ideological course. He was taking, very realistically, not taking into account the ideology and all that. He was, a man which is functioning in the army and in a hierarchical structure. And he told, at the time of socialism, we had much more possibility to have information from the ground. And it was better. So what? Said that's he was not a Marxist Leninist. He was just a normal officer looking at realistically at how it functions.
Okay, so there are the questions. I didn't read because I am listening you, and all the time you are don't stopping. But
You can stop me. Very be,
yes,
be a
yes.
little bit more
No, no,
democratic.
no. But when you are speaking clever things, the question can wait. So this question, which we don't understand, it's written in Polish now. But I
Mhm.
think that you already tried to answer this.
Maybe.
Chodziło mi o to, czy Ujgurów da się zresocjalizować, czy odniesie to skutek podobny do próby napełnienia dziurowego wiadra. And there is also other question, but I think that similar. Are there any Uyghur communist organizations or prominent Uyghur figures in Chinese Communist Party that could counterbalance imperialist propaganda in Xinjiang? And I also want to ask my question: could you compare the what was the political of the France toward the terrorists from France who go to who went to Syria, and after they come back to France, they started organize the terrorist attack in France. What is the official politic, the France toward these people? And compare this politic with the Chinese politic toward the Uyghur who were in Syria and come back to China and organize terrorist attack in China.
Concerning re-education, of course, I don't really know exactly how it functions and what are the results. But anyway, we have people which were in the so-called vocational center, where they give them political education, but also they teach them some working specialities they will work after. And of course, maybe it's propaganda, but at least you have some of them which are completely reintegrated inside the economical system after leaving schools. But of course, the re-education is not a special policy that was carried on in Xinjiang. From the very beginning of the People's Republic of China, all over China, in prison, you have so-called re-education through work, and the idea that the prison has not to be a place where you punish, but a place where you re-educate people as good citizens. Of course, we can criticize how it was concretely realized, but basically the fundamentals of the Chinese Communist Party ideology is that every human being which is corrupt, who is corrupt, can be re-educated. And that's why, for example, you have something in China which sounds very strange for Westerners. It is the fact that, as you know, in China there is the death penalty. Of course, we can discuss about the question of death penalty, which was a question that became with the very beginning of socialism in Soviet Union and later. But this question, of course, is another question. But anyway, inside China, you have the death penalty, but you have two death penalties. You have the death penalty, the complete death penalty. It means a death penalty where the people which is judged is considered as so corrupt that he has no chance to be re-educated, and you have the so-called 2 years 2 years death penalty. It means that you have 2 years, and during these 2 years, the one punished of death penalty is re-educated, and after 2 years, they decide if the re-education is a success, and then he will not be executed, or is not a success, and he is executed. Of course, we can discuss if it's a good or a bad idea, but the fact, what I wanted to show there is the fact that the idea is that even somebody which is supposed to have commit crimes so bad that he can be considered as a non-citizen anymore and has to be executed, there is always the idea that maybe inside himself he can find something that will make him a good citizen back, and that he will work for the collectivity back, and that he has not to be executed. That's one thing. Second thing is that from the very beginning of the Chinese People's Republic, national minorities, and especially Uyghurs, they have a very important function, not only locally, but nationally. In the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China, you have Tibetan, you have Uyghurs. In the central government of China, you have people from different ethnic origin, including Uyghurs. That's the first thing. And in Xinjiang, you have quota policies. It means that all the administration of the province is not only divided by people from Uyghur origin and Han origin, but all ethnical group have to have some of their members inside the local central administration. So you have in the Uyghur autonomous region, the president is always a Uyghur. Then you have Kazakh, you have Kyrgyz, you have Han Chinese, you have Hui. And the party organization, the first secretary of the party, very often he's a Han Chinese, because in China you have the idea that the first secretary of the party must change from one region to another. So if you have a first secretary in Xinjiang, he was a first secretary first in, let's say, central China province. Then he comes to Xinjiang, and he goes on another region, and he's circulating all over the country. And in every region of the country, his results are examined. And if the results of his policy are judged positively in different regions of the country, then he can be promoted to the central committee. So because of that, the first secretary of the party in Xinjiang is very often a Han, but you can have a Uyghur, which will be the first secretary in a province of eastern or southern China, because they are circulating all over. So of course that, for example, the policemen in Xinjiang, the majority of the policemen are Uyghurs. They are not Han Chinese. The majority of local administrations are Uyghurs or Kazakh, because inside the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, you have region where the minority of the minorities are in majority. So inside Xinjiang, inside the Uyghur Autonomous Region, you have a Kazakh Autonomous Region, a Kyrgyz Autonomous Region, and so on and so on. So you have two levels of autonomy. You have the regional level autonomy, which is mostly Uyghur, and the local level of autonomy, which can be Kazakh, which can be Tajik, which can be Kyrgyz, which can be Mongolian, and not Uyghur. So you have a two-level autonomy. The Chinese autonomy system is a system of autonomy from the province up to the local village, because all over China you have sometimes local minorities which are just in majority in one village. If the village is a minority, this village will have a special local autonomy inside a region which is Han Chinese. For example, at the Korean border, at the border with North Korea, you have a province which is Jilin. It's a Chinese province. It's a Chinese minority province. But inside this Chinese majority, Han Chinese majority province, you have a special local, in Western language, county, let's say, or district, a local Korean autonomous district inside the Han Chinese minority. And in the same region, which was earlier called Manchuria, you have also a region with Manchu autonomous districts inside the Han Chinese Han Chinese majority province. So, and of course, when I tell that you have autonomy, it means that the local leaders are coming from the local minority. So you have Korean leaders inside China, as you have Uyghur leaders inside China. And that's why, for example, when, the French Association of Friends of Korea, they are not talking about two Koreas, they are talking about three Koreas, because there is South Korea, there is North Korea, and there is Chinese Korea. Because in the north of North Korea, you have a Korean district within the Chinese People's Republic. So the situation is the same for Mongolians, for Uyghurs, for Tibetans, for Chuangs, and for all ethnic minorities. And when you look at Chinese medias, or even let's call them Chinese propaganda, they have interview with Uyghur leaders. They have interview with Uyghur imams. They talk with them. They show you but you will never have them in Western medias, because the Western journalists tell they cannot go to Xinjiang, but they can go to Xinjiang, just that they don't want to go to Xinjiang, because if they go to Xinjiang, they will have to make interview with those people, and they don't want to give voice to those people. Because those people are, let's say, integrated Uyghurs. Now, I'm not able to tell you what is the percentage of integrated Uyghurs to the People's Republic system, and what is the percentage of Uyghurs who are against the system. I think that the proportion are evolving, but anyway, that's for sure. You have two sides among Uyghurs, and you have Uyghurs who have top functions inside the Chinese states or inside the Chinese economy also. For example, the leader of the Uyghur campaign in United States, the World Uyghur Organization, she decided that she took side of the American, but she cannot deny the fact that she was one of the prominent businesswomen of China earlier. So, I mean, she made career in People's China. She made a strong economical career in People's China. And at a certain moment, she decided to go on the American side. But anyway, if Uyghur would have been repressed as they tell us they are repressed, she wouldn't be in the United States now, because she wouldn't have been a businesswoman in China earlier. And that we have also to take into account.
Okay, in the beginning of the conversation, you said that Xinjiang province.
I forgot to answer to your question concerning France.
Yes.
Yes. France is completely hypocritical. No, it is for sure, because at the very beginning of the so-called Syrian revolution, so-called, of course, Soviet revolution, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Laurent Fabius, called the so-called insurgents freedom fighters. And you had huge program of TV showing that Assad is a very bad regime and it has to be fought and so on and so on. And you had young people, especially from Islamic origin, who decided to go to fight for freedom in Syria. And if you understand how they were behaving at that time, you must understand that they were under propaganda. Syria is a dictatorship. In France, I have no work because it's unemployment. My Minister of Foreign Affairs is telling that we have freedom fighters there. I go there to fight for freedom. They went to fight for freedom, and they were trained in a extremist Islamic way, and then they come back to France. But where is the responsible of that? It's the French government, because it's the French government who knew that there were terrorists, who sent them to Syria. But they had a very bad idea in Syria, because in Syria they were supposed to fight and to change the regime, and they didn't fight. They even didn't die, and they come back to France. Of course, they are fanatics now, but who is responsible for their fanaticism? It's France. It's French government, because they used them. They sent them to Syria. They knew that they had that in France there are a social problem. They didn't manage to fight with. They knew that there are a lot of young unemployed and they don't know what to do. So they send them to Syria to make the business of the Western imperialism. And they had the bad idea there not to die fighting Assad. They had the bad idea to survive. So when they come back to France, of course they are fanatics. But why they are fanatics? Who sent them there? Who allowed them to go to Syria? Who told them it's freedom fighters at the very beginning of the story? So it's pure hypocrisy. And of course, when they are coming back to France, they are bad guys. They were good guys when they were fighting for democracy against Assad in 2011. And after they became fanatics, and after they had the bad idea not to be killed, and after they come back to France, and they are fanatics. So when they took them, they send them to jail. Then they send them to jail when it happens who they are. But I have one example of one man who was working as le concierge, dozorca. I don't know in English how you call the man who is looking from
janitor? No.
Janitor, yeah, the janitor. He was janitor at, I think, the Aix-en-Provence University. And one Syrian guy looked at him and remembered he was one of the Daesh officers. And then he told to the French administration that man was a Daesh officer. And of course, they arrested him. But how can the French secret service not know he was a Daesh officer? I mean, they knew. They don't care. If he was discovered, then they must arrest him. But he had a very good job in France up to that time. So, it's completely cynical. It's not only France, of course, it's all Western countries which are completely cynical about Syrian issues and all Muslim issues. Even Hillary Clinton recognized that the Islamist extremism was created by the United States in Afghanistan in 1979. Zbigniew Brzezinski was very happy with that. In an interview in the Nouvel Observateur in 1995, he told that we created that freedom fighters, Islamic freedom fighters, and it was very good because it was against Soviet Union. And the journalist asked him, yes, but you created a terrorist group which are responsible of terrorism. And Brzezinski answered, oh, it's not very bad because they destroyed Soviet Union, and that's the basic things. what they are doing now is not very dangerous anyway. So what? So it means that the 9/11 was not very dangerous. No, of course, for the big American bourgeoisie, they were not in the World Trade Center at that moment. Only it was at the earlier time of the day. You had only the servants there, but the high bourgeoisie was not in the World Trade Center, so they don't care about it.
Um, so in the beginning of the conversation, you said that the reason why there was this terrorist activity, it was the poverty.
Yeah.
And now the Xinjiang region is one of the fastest growing economies in China, and it is one of the reason why this terrorist activity is stopped.
Not only also the
No?
repression, because of course
Yes,
the
yes, yes, yes,
Chinese
yes.
police organize repression. We have not to doubt about that.
Yes. So for me, it is a little similar for two other situations in the history. And what is your opinion about this? First situation, it is the uh, Chechnya,
Yeah, of
Chechnya,
course.
that in 1990s they organized the terrorist attacks, and after when Putin he started to collaborate with Kadyrov, and it's Kadyrov who started to organize Chechnya. Now it is a region where there are this terrorist activity is finished,
Yeah,
and
yeah, of course.
if there are terrorists in Chechnya, it is the police of the Kadyrov who are
Yeah, right.
shooting these
Yeah, of
people,
course.
not
It's not
Russia.
a very free region. That's of course.
But and also we have I think similarities for the Poland in 1870s, after the fall of the January insurrection in Poland,
Mhm.
that
Yeah,
we
yeah,
have
yeah.
many
The uprising.
insurrections, uprising in Poland. And in 1870s, it was the very fastest
Mhm.
industrialization. And in this time of the industrialization, the people who all the time wanted to prepare a new uprising, and the first time they started to be in minority, because the
Yeah, 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 yeah,
majority
yeah.
of the population, Polish population, we don't want to continue this. We want to
To integrate in a development policy.
yes, we want to export to Russia, because in Russia now we have
Yeah, yeah. Also, yeah.
big money to okay.
Yeah,
You know,
you're right. Yeah, you basically you're right. I mean, imperialists or capitalists are using miscontent that can be national, tribal, religious, or whatever you want. When they have in front of them a competitor or a class enemy. But as soon as the economical and social situation began to normalize, let's say more or less, the ground for miscontent is changing, and then you have another form of miscontent, but it's a rather class struggle. And I think that in China you have class struggle within the structures of power, but it's another thing, because the miscontent of a poor Uyghur who doesn't see any perspective for his life can quite easily be organized on religious or ethnical ground. But when you have a Uyghur worker which is working in a factory and which is not happy with the way the factory functions, which is not happy with the salary he receives, he will not become terrorist. He will become rather a striking worker. In China, every year, more or less. That's the official statistics. So I'm not talking about Western propaganda or whatever. You have 10,000 strikes, about 10,000 strikes every year. People who are striking in China, they are striking. They are not terrorists because they are working. And when you are working, you don't want to destroy the tool where you are working. You want to change the administration of the place you are working. And in China, of course, I told you there are 10,000 strikes, but there are 10,000 strikes almost always in the private sector. You have no strike in the state sector. Because of course, if you work in the state sector, you have much better situation, socially speaking. And of course, every Chinese, whatever he's Uyghur, Han, Tibetan, or whatever, he wants to work for public enterprises because that's the best way, the best place you will work there. Private sector is just the place where you work when you cannot find work in the public sector. And the Chinese government is very clear about that. That step by step, the private sector will disappear in favor of a much more efficient public socialist sector. But for the moment, China is still at the very beginning of its modernization process, and that's why Chinese communists have to tolerate private sectors. But if you find work in private sector anyway, when you are miscontent, you will strike, but you will not go to the terrorists. The terrorists, it's based on the petit bourgeois ideology. When you are isolated from masses, when you are isolated from social and political process, and your frustration are taken and manipulated by terrorist organizations who know how to manipulate individual frustrations isolated from class issues.
Okay, so my last question is short. What do you think about the perspective for the Western propaganda in the time of the new Cold War with China? Because in the time with the Cold War with Soviet Union, they can say whatever they wanted, and people in the Western countries don't have the possibilities to verify the source. Today, with internet, one day they say that we, all the Western people, we have to be make solidarity with Roman Protasiewicz. But in the same day, you see his. Before this, you don't know who is this guy. But you listen Roman Protasiewicz, you search in internet, and you see that he is a terrorist in Azov, neo-Nazi organization, and that he photo of him there, and you can verify in very quickly who is this guy. And of course, in this time, all this Western propaganda is fallen because it's and the same time the same situation is that all this big propaganda against Xinjiang.
That's the same thing,
Yes, I think that it was something very racist.
Yes, of course.
The Western journalists they think that people are very stupid. They don't nothing about China. And before this, nobody heard about Xinjiang province. But now we can verify that everybody can go there. You go there, you see that that it is. Tomorrow you can go there. Verify.
No, not tomorrow because of COVID, but that's another thing.
Yes, but now it's very easy to verify these lies. So
but there is one, the Western propaganda functions now on two main bases. The first one is that most people have no time and no even imagination to look for alternative informations. Because, people in the West are very tired. Because the way of life we have is very, very exhausting. And people are tired, they are physically tired, and they are mentally tired. And because of that, you have only a minority which will take times to verify news. Of course, these people are doing that. But for the moment, I think it will change. But for the moment, a large part of the society, maybe the majority or maybe the minority, but if it's a minority, it's a strong minority, are, let's say, ideologically dominated by the mainstream medias. And for different reasons, they accept that. And the regime we have is functioning because this passive part of the population is sufficient to control the situation. Up to now, of course, it can change, but up to now, the passive, intellectually passive part, and of course, politically passive part of the population is passively accepting the dominating rule. And they don't look for alternative informations, especially when you can try to manipulate them. For example, it's not really possible in Pakistan, but in France, it's quite easy possible to tell the Muslims that your brothers in Xinjiang are oppressed by a very, very horrible communist regime. Support Western democracy because we love you. That's an example. And you can have the same things about Armenians, about Jews, about Bretons, about Corsicans, or about whatever. You will find groups that you can try to manipulate against other groups. That's one thing. But apparently it's not sufficient, because if you look at the campaigns we have against so-called fake news, and the campaigns we have that, there are a lot of things in internet that should be controlled. It is showing that the rising tendency in Western so-called democracies is censorship. So it means that they know now that too many people are looking for alternative information, and they are preparing censorship laws. You have some in the United States, some in France, some in England, some in Poland, and so on. And I think that now one of the main struggle we have to fight for is the issue. We don't want your censorship. We are able to think by ourselves. Don't talk us about fake news, because fake news are coming from your side most often. But it's a tough struggle because of terrorism, because of extremism. It's very easy, because of racism. It's very easy to say, censorship is useful because there are hate discourses we have to fight against. And this is the pretext to censor not hate speeches, not only hate speeches, but mostly alternative speeches. That's the point we are now. I don't know what will happen in 5 years.
Okay, thank you, Bruno. It's very, very pessimistic, which you said, because if they want to,
we have to struggle. We have to struggle.
Yes, but if they started to make censorship in YouTube,
they do. They already.
Yes, maybe.
In Facebook, in YouTube, in Twitter. I mean, whatever you think about Trump, I of course, I'm not an admirer of Trump. But he was censored. The president of the United States was censored by Twitter. I mean, you cannot hear what he's telling your president. You can hate him, but at least you must know what he's telling. It's not obvious. So if they censor the president, they can censor Michał Nowicki much easier.
They can very
Yeah,
easy.
yeah. That's it.
So we will return to the traditional way of, and we have to in this time to organize meeting in the street and
Yeah, yeah,
speaking.
yeah. No, but street and enterprises are the place we have to govern.
Okay, thank you.